The blade came out of nowhere, and John Thatcher had half a second to realize he was going to die. He had been on his knees in the mud, working the wedge deeper into a stubborn slab of granite that refused to split cleanly along its fault line, when the shadow fell across him, and the air turned sharp with the smell of old iron. He rolled sideways purely on instinct, years of working alone on exposed cliffsides having taught his body to respond before his mind caught up. And the knife meant for his throat carved a line of cold fire across his collarbone instead. He scrambled to his feet with the iron wedge still in his hand, which was not a sword but was heavy enough to crack a man's skull if it had to, and he squared off against the figure in the morning mist. The man facing him was Guard Dunlow, and John had known Guard would come for him eventually. Guard ran the harbor racket that taxed every fishing boat putting out from Crestfall, and John had made the catastrophic error of building a well and a breakwater wall for the fisherman collective, without first paying Guard his customary fee for the privilege of working in Crestfall at all. It had seemed like the kind of thing a decent man simply did not do, pay a bully for the right to help honest people. And now, he was learning the cost of decency in a harbor town run by knives and silent threats. Guard was not alone. He had two men flanking him, thick-armed dock workers who moonlighted as his enforcers, and John had one wedge and no backup and 6 feet of scrubby coastal grass between him and the cliff edge behind him. "You should have paid the fee, Mason," Guard said pleasantly. "I'm not unreasonable. I just don't like being made to look soft." John tightened his grip on the wedge and said nothing, calculating angles. One of the flanking men was moving to his left, trying to cut off his retreat toward the village lane. The other held a short cudgel and was grinning in the comfortable way of a man who knew exactly how this was going to end. He never got to find out if his calculation was any good, because that was when Murbul Doomhammer walked out of the morning mist and into the space between John Thatcher and the man with the knife. She had come down from the cliff road that wound above the harbor, the same road John used every morning to reach the quarry shelf, and she moved with the unhurried authority of something that had never in its life needed to hurry because nothing had ever been fast enough to threaten her. She was tall, half a head taller than John, who was not short and built with the dense, deliberate power of someone who had trained for war since childhood. Green skin darkened to deep olive at her temples and the backs of her broad hands, and her tusks were short and smooth and slightly curved, the ivory pale against the vivid color of her mouth. Her dark hair was pulled back in a thick warrior's braid that fell between her shoulder blades, threaded through with a copper ring near the tip. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, a sleeveless vest of dark brown boiled hide that laced up the front and hugged the line of her torso, paired with close-fitted leather breeches tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles. A short curved blade hung at each hip, well worn, with wrapped hilts that had seen serious use. A single pauldron of segmented iron sat on her right shoulder, strapped across her chest with a dark leather band. She looked like what she was, a professional traveling alone through rough country with no illusions about what the world might ask of her before nightfall. She stopped between John and Guard, and she looked at Guard Dunlow with an expression that John would later describe to himself as a landslide looking at a pebble. "Is there a problem here?" she said. Her voice was low and even and did not go up at the end the way a question normally does. Guard stared at her. His two men stared at her. The morning mist breathed around them all. "This is human business, Greenskin," Guard said, because Guard was either very brave or catastrophically stupid, and John had already concluded it was the latter. "The man behind me is bleeding," Murbul said. "Someone cut him. I am curious who was stupid enough to cut a man in front of me." John pressed his hand to his collarbone and felt the warm seep of blood through his fingers, and decided that, whatever this orc woman's reasons for being on the cliff road at dawn, he was profoundly glad of them. Guard looked at his two men, and his two men looked at each other, and then Guard looked back at Murbul, and apparently made some private assessment of the situation that led him to a decision John thought was probably the first intelligent one he had ever made. He put the knife away. He jerked his chin at his men. He looked past Murbul at John with the flat, patient eyes of a man who knows he will simply try again tomorrow. "We're done here for now," Guard said. "For now." He walked away into the mist with his men following, and John Thatcher stood in the coastal grass with his hand pressed to his collarbone and watched the most remarkable person he had ever seen turn around and look at him. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Then walk," she said, and turned back toward the village lane as if this had been a perfectly routine morning. He walked. He was somewhat aware that he was staring at the back of her braid and the confident set of her shoulders, but he could not quite stop. Her name, she told him when he finally asked, once they had reached the lower lane and the salt smell of the harbor replaced the cold grass smell of the clifftop, was Murbul Doomhammer. She was a sellsword of considerable experience. She had come to Crestfall by rumor, specifically the rumor that reached every sellsword and wandering mercenary eventually, that a thing called the Thornback had been ranging along the northern coastal cliffs for 2 seasons, killing sheep and fishermen and occasionally whole dock crews, and that the town council of Crestfall was offering a sum of coin that made the risk worth evaluating. "What's a Thornback?" John asked. He was pressing a folded rag to his collarbone and feeling slightly lightheaded, not entirely from the blood loss. "Big, armored, comes up from the water," she said. "Something between a crab and a bull if you want to picture it. I've killed one before in the Ash Narrows. It wasn't easy. And you came alone." She looked at him sideways. It was a brief look, but it landed like a thrown stone. "I work alone." He wanted to ask why, but she had the kind of manner that made you weigh your questions carefully before you spent them, so he filed it away and introduced himself instead. Stonemason by trade. He had been in Crestfall for 3 months, contracted by the fishing collective to repair the harbor walls and dig 2 new wells. He told her about Guard Dunlow and the harbor fee, though he suspected she had already assessed the situation before she walked into it. "You're going to need to deal with that," she said. "The man won't stop because I looked at him this morning." "I know," John said. "You were going to fight 3 men with a chisel." "Wedge," he said. "It's heavier." She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly closed off. "Still 3 men. I wasn't planning to win. I was planning to make enough noise that someone heard from the lane." She looked at him again, and this time the look was longer and had something different in it. A small recalibration, like someone adjusting a measurement they had taken quickly and now wanted to check again. He met her eyes, which were a dark amber brown that caught the sea light, and he did not look away, and after a moment she turned her face forward and they walked the rest of the way to the village without speaking, which was how John Thatcher met Murbul Doomhammer, and how the whole strange, dangerous, heart-altering season began. Crestfall was the kind of town that had been built in spite of itself. It clung to a notch in the rocky northern coast where the cliffs broke briefly into a sheltered bay, and the harbor it had grown around was deep and cold, and ringed with black stone that ate the bottoms out of boats that came in wrong. The people were fishermen and salters and net menders, with a scattering of merchants who serviced them, and they had the particular brand of toughness that comes from working a hostile sea for generations. They did not like outsiders as a general rule, and they liked orcs specifically even less, with the worn-in distrust of a people who had been raided by orcish war bands 2 generations back and had not done enough forgiving since. This was apparent within the first hour. John brought Murbul to the Salt Anchor, the town's main tavern, and the place where the fishing collective held its meetings, because he had calculated that the Thornback problem was serious enough that the collective would be willing to overlook her species if it meant getting the creature killed. He was right in the practical sense. The collective's head, an old fisherman named Bren Aldwick, who had 3 fingers missing from his left hand and no patience for anything that wasted his time, looked at Murbul with the expression of a man doing difficult arithmetic, and then said he would pay half the bounty in advance and the rest on proof of the kill. The rest of the common room was less businesslike about it. John felt it in the way the conversations quieted and then rebuilt themselves at lower, more pointed volumes when Murbul walked in. He felt it in the way the serving boy took a long time to bring her a cup of cider and set it down too hard. He felt it in the way Dorrell, one of Guard Dunlow's men, was sitting in the far corner watching them with small, satisfied eyes. And John understood that Guard was going to try to use the town's general discomfort with orcs to his advantage, and that this was going to make the next weeks complicated in more than one way. Murbul sat through all of it with her back straight and her hands flat on the table, and her face arranged in the precise neutral expression of someone who has been in this exact room 100 times before and knows exactly how to exist in it without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land. John watched her do it. It took something out of him, seeing that. The careful armor of it. The discipline required to sit in a room full of quiet hostility and drink your cider and look like you don't feel any of it. After Bren Aldwick concluded the arrangement and left, John said, quietly, "You can stay on my site if you need a place. I've got a camp on the East Quarry Shelf, out of town." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you just saved my life this morning and you shouldn't have to sleep in a place where people are staring at your back." Something moved in her expression. It was subtle, a slight relaxing of a muscle along her jaw, but he caught it. "I've slept in worse than stairs," she said. "I know you have," he said, and kept his voice plain because he was not trying to make her feel fragile. "The offer stands." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll take it," she said. He set up a second tent on the quarry shelf that same evening, working by the last of the daylight while she watched from a flat boulder where she had set out her kit to inspect and oil. He was aware of her eyes on him while he worked, not suspicious, just observant in the thorough, habitual way of someone who spent their life reading environments for threat assessments, and it made him focus with slightly more care than usual on what he was doing with the tent pegs, which was ridiculous, and he knew it. She brought him supper from the camp pot without being asked, setting the bowl near his knee with the same matter-of-fact directness she did everything, and he thanked her and ate, and they sat together on the edge of the quarry shelf with the harbor spread below them and the last orange sky over the water, and John felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the particular comfort of not being alone. He was, in fact, quite thoroughly alone most of the time. It was not something he suffered dramatically. He was not the kind of man who made a performance of solitude, but it was real and persistent in the way of things that have been true so long you stop noticing them directly. He had grown up the youngest of 4 siblings in a mountain village inland from the coast, the kind of family where resources were thin enough that the children were expected to find their own way as soon as they could manage it. He had apprenticed to a stonemason at 14, worked his way to journeyman by 20, and spent the years since traveling from contract to contract, building what people needed and then moving on. He was 27 now, solid and sun-darkened, with calloused hands and a quiet manner and a tendency to think carefully before he spoke, and he had discovered a long time ago that the kind of man who thinks before he speaks is often simply not noticed in rooms full of people who don't bother. He was decent at his work. He was honest, which was a harder thing to be than most people admitted. He had saved a small amount of coin over the years and spent it on good tools and warm boots, and he rarely went to bed hungry, and by most measurements of a working life in a hard world he was doing fine. But there was a shape of a person-sized absence in his days that he had gotten so used to feeling that he had mostly stopped believing it would ever be filled. He was thinking about none of this consciously on that first evening, sitting on the quarry shelf with Murbul Doomhammer. He was simply sitting, and she was simply sitting, and the harbor was lit gold below them, and it was a very good evening in a way he would only understand later. Over the following days, they fell into a rough parallel rhythm. John worked the quarry face and the harbor walls in the mornings, splitting stone and mortaring courses, and doing the patient, physical work that had always centered him. Murbul scouted the coast, mapping the thornback's probable range and hunting patterns with the methodical precision of a professional who knew that killing something big and armored required knowing more about it than it knew about you. She shared what she found with him in the evenings, not because she needed to, but because he asked intelligent questions and did not treat her expertise as something that required extra translation. He knew what it was to read rock, to look at a cliff face and understand its grain, its weaknesses, the way water had worked into it over centuries, where it was likely to fail. She knew what it was to read a hunting ground the same way, and they found a vocabulary in this parallel knowledge that surprised them both. "It's using the sea caves below the eastern shelf," she told him one evening, crouching over the rough map she had drawn on a piece of flat board. "There's a pattern to when the bodies have been found, always after a high spring tide. I think it ranges inland to feed when the tides push it up." John studied the map. He knew the eastern shelf well had quarried from the top of it, and once climbed down the face to check a seam of good limestone that turned out to go too far into the salt water to be worth extracting. "There's an undercut about 30 feet above the cave mouths," he said. "Overhang, I always thought it looked unstable." She looked at him. "How much stone is in that overhang?" "Several tons," he said. "Maybe more. I never tested it properly because I didn't want to work under it." The amber eyes sharpened. "Could you bring it down?" He thought about it with the serious, methodical assessment he gave any structural question. "If I got into the right fault and drove the right wedges, it would take time. And I'd need to be sure the thornback was in the cave first." "I can get it in the cave," she said. He believed her. They sat with the plan between them like a piece of work they were both contributing to, and John felt the unusual pleasure of being genuinely useful to someone who genuinely needed the specific thing he knew. Murbul was a warrior and a skilled one, but she had been brought here to kill something too armored to simply hack at, and his knowledge of the cliff face gave her a method she could not have generated alone. He was not protected by her in this moment. He was her partner. It was a feeling he wanted to hold carefully and not examine too hard, because it felt very good and he was not sure he trusted things that felt very good to last. The problem of Guard Dunlow did not wait for them to address it. It addressed them first. It was 10 days into the arrangement, and John had just returned from a full morning at the harbor wall, a good morning's work, 3 courses of stone laid and the mortar setting well, when he found Murbul at the quarry camp with 3 men standing around her in the broad, blocking way of men who want you to feel contained. They were not Guard's usual enforcers. They were strangers, coastmen by their clothes, and they were carrying crossbows, which were a significant step up from the usual cudgels and knives, and John felt his stomach drop in the particular way it does when a situation is worse than expected. He did not hesitate. He walked directly into the circle without slowing, put himself at Murbul's shoulder and said to the man in front, "Is there something I can help you with?" The man looked at him with professional disinterest. "Dunlow sends a message. The mason pays the fee or the mason's work gets unmade. Walls come down. Wells get fouled. The orc leaves Crestfall before the week is out or someone gets hurt. Someone is going to get hurt if you point that crossbow any direction but the sky," Murbul said, and her voice was flat and absolutely certain in the way that John had come to recognize meant she was not speaking in abstractions. The man with the crossbow made an unhappy calculation and pointed it at the sky. Not because he was afraid, John thought, but because at some level of professional instinct he had taken the measure of Murbul Doomhammer and decided that the particular confidence in her voice was the kind that came from actual capability rather than bluffing. "Dunlow's message is delivered," the man said, and the 3 of them walked down the quarry path without further ceremony. John turned to Murbul. "Are you all right?" "I'm always all right," she said, but she was watching the 3 men go with a tight, careful expression. "He's escalating. Crossbows mean he spent coin on this, not just time." "Why does he want you gone specifically?" "Because I'm the thing that might tip the balance," she said quietly. "Town dislikes me. He knows that. He's planning to use it." She looked at John steadily. "You should know. If I become a liability to you, I can find another place to know, John said, and the word came out with a firmness that surprised even him. He had not been prepared to say it quite that quickly or that clearly. He held her gaze and said it again. No. You're not going anywhere, not because of him. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Something shifted in her expression again, that same small adjustment he had seen in the salt anchor, except this time it did not close off as quickly. She held his gaze for an extra beat, and in that beat there was something that was not assessment, not professional calculation, but something warmer and more uncertain, like a door opened just a crack before she consciously pulled it shut. "All right," she said. "Then we solve Dunlow and the Thornback at the same time. If I kill the Thornback, the town council owes me the bounty. Money and a successful contract give me standing in Crestfall that Dunlow can't simply dismiss. And if we also have evidence of Dunlow's extortion," John said, "the collective would be very interested to hear about it. They've been paying his fees under pressure for years." Her eyes narrowed, but not with hostility, with the look of a strategist assessing a move. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've had time," he said, "while I was laying stone." This time the sound she almost made was clearly a laugh. Short, involuntary, quickly swallowed but real. It was the first time he had heard it, and it hit him with a warmth so specific and unambiguous that he had to turn and find something to do with his hands to cover the expression it put on his face. The plan for the Thornback required a week of preparation. John spent 3 of those days on the cliff face above the sea caves, working carefully with his smallest chisels to locate and test the fault lines in the overhang. He worked with ropes because the drop below was 60 feet to the sea, and the ledges in between were too narrow to catch him. And he worked in the gray morning light before the mist burned off, because the afternoons brought wind off the water that made cliff work genuinely dangerous. Murbul came with him on the second day, ostensibly to check his progress, and she turned out to be useful on the cliff face in a way he had not predicted. She moved on the ropes with the casual ease of someone for whom heights were simply another terrain to be assessed and navigated, and she held the drill steady while he drove the iron peg that would anchor the drop line for the wedge work, and their hands overlapped briefly on the drill shaft, and he was aware of the warmth of her fingers and the way she did not pull them away immediately. He did not make anything of it. He noted it internally with the careful attention he gave things he did not want to damage by pressing on them too hard, and he kept his focus on the rock face, and she kept hers, and they worked well together in the particular silence of 2 people who have established enough comfort with each other to not need to fill it. On the 3rd day, while he was re-examining the main fault line, he told her about his family. He was not sure why. Perhaps it was the quality of the silence, which had become the kind of silence you can put things into. He told her about the mountain village and the 4 siblings and the stonemason who had taken him on and taught him how to read stone. He told her about the slow, pleasurable satisfaction of a wall built straight, the particular way a well-split stone fell into its course like it had always been meant to be there. He did not tell her about the loneliness, because that felt like too much, but he thought perhaps she already understood something of it from the way he had described the years of moving from contract to contract. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was a warband guard under a warchief named Draugr in the Ashfield territories for 6 years. He waited. Draugr died in a border skirmish 2 years ago. The band dissolved. I've been working alone since then." She paused. Orcish warbands are not, she seemed to be choosing words carefully. They are not simply work arrangements. They are family in the way that matters practically. You eat together, you keep each other alive. You know who will stand at your left side in a bad situation and who will not, and that knowledge is— She stopped. "It's the whole world," John said quietly. She looked at him sharply as if she had not expected the understanding to come that precisely. Then, after a moment, "Yes, it is." They worked in silence after that, but it was a different silence than before, fuller. The night of the Thornback hunt came on a high-tide evening with a low, heavy sky and the smell of rain on the water. Murbul went down to the cliff base by the long coastal path to drive the creature into the cave. She had spent 4 days baiting it with offal dropped from the cliff edge and had a thorough understanding of its patterns now. And John took his position above the overhang with his wedges and his heaviest maul. He was afraid, if he was being honest with himself. Not because he doubted the plan, but because the plan required Murbul to be between him and a several hundred stone armored sea creature in an enclosed space, and that thought had been sitting cold and heavy in his chest since they had finalized the arrangement. He had told himself this was professional concern, the way you worried about a partner on a risky job. He had been mostly unsuccessful in convincing himself. He heard it come in. Even from 60 feet above, the sound of the thornback moving through the sea cave mouth was like boulders grinding. He heard Murbul's voice, 2 short, sharp words in Orcish that he did not understand but which were clearly curses. And then the sound of the creature's movement changed, going deeper into the cave rather than forward, and he heard her quick, retreating footsteps below. He drove the first wedge. The rock cracked in a way that told him immediately it was going to work, which was a relief so profound it was almost physical. The fault ran exactly as he had calculated, which was not guaranteed even with careful work. Stone was honest but not always cooperative. He drove the second wedge 6 feet along the fault line, and the overhang began to tilt, and then he drove the third and the whole mass gave way with a sound like 100 thunderclaps compressed into 4 seconds, and 60 tons of limestone fell directly into the cave mouth below. The sound of the thornback stopping was very brief. Then there was a long, ringing silence, and then he heard Murbul's voice from below and to the left, which meant she had made it to the safe ledge they had designated. Thatcher. "I'm here," he called down. "It's done," she said. "It worked." He sat on the cliff edge with the dust still rising from below and his hands shaking slightly from the force of the maul work, and he felt something enormous and uncomplicated. Relief that she was alive. He pressed his palms flat on the cold rock and breathed until his hands stopped shaking, and then he began to coil his ropes, and by the time she appeared on the path below the overhang, she found him entirely composed and occupied with equipment management, which was, he thought, probably the most dignified available option. She was covered in limestone dust, and there was a shallow cut on her left forearm from a flying chip, and she looked up at him from the path with an expression that was very open for someone whose face was usually so carefully arranged. "You were precise," she said. "I've never worked with someone who was that precise with stone." "You were exactly where you needed to be," he said. "That's not nothing in the dark with that thing behind you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she climbed the last section of path to the cliff top, and when she reached him she stopped very close, not touching, but close enough that he was intensely aware of the warmth of her, the smell of salt and leather and limestone dust, and something beneath those that was simply her, and she said quietly, "Thank you, John." She had not used his given name before. Always Thatcher, the professional distance of it, the same shorthand she might use with anyone. John. It was a small thing. It arrived like sunlight on cold stone. "Any time," he said, and meant it in every possible sense of the phrase. They brought the thornback's plates, segments of its shell, impossible to fake back to the salt anchor, and Bryn Aldwick paid Murbul the second half of the bounty in coin on the table while the entire common room watched. The atmosphere was complicated. There was relief. The thornback had taken 4 fishermen and 11 sheep over 2 seasons, and its removal was genuinely significant. But relief in Crestfall did not come easily, and several of the men in the room looked at Murbul with the permanent suspicion that no practical success was going to shift. This was when Guard Dunlow made his move. He stood up from his table in the corner. He had been waiting, John understood, for exactly this moment, and he said, loudly enough that the room's various conversations stopped, "Pretty neat, having an orc do the dirty work. Course, now you've paid her, you might want to count your fingers." He smiled at the room with the comfortable confidence of a man who knew what a crowd wanted to hear. "Thing about greenskins, they know how to make themselves useful until they've got what they want. Then the counting changes. The room was very quiet. John watched it happen, watched the half-dozen faces that had been moving toward grudging acceptance reset toward the old suspicion, the familiar groove, the easier road. Watched Murbul go still with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow and choosing how to respond to it. He stood up. He was not, objectively, the most intimidating person in the room. He was a stonemason of average height and considerable physical solidity, but no particular reputation for violence. He was the person most of this room had barely noticed over 3 months, the quiet man who built things and didn't cause trouble. But he stood up and he looked at Guard Dunlow across the room and he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "Guard, you sent 3 men with crossbows to my camp last week to threaten me and my partner. I've been collecting statements about the harbor fee you've been extracting from the fishing collective for the past 4 years. I have names and dates and amounts. I was planning to give them to Bren Aldwick tonight, and I'm still planning to give them to Bren Aldwick tonight. What you say in the next 30 seconds is going to determine whether I also share them with the Coastal Warden's office in Kelport." The silence in the room changed quality. Became the silence of a room paying very close attention. Guard's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did. He was looking at John with the calculating stillness of a man revising his assessment. "That's a serious accusation." "The statements are real," John said. "You know they are. Boren Haslack's wife gave me 2 seasons of tallies. Mech Furlong gave me 4 years. I've got 7 others." He kept his voice level and his eyes on Guard. "But none of that is why I'm standing up. I'm standing up because you just insulted someone who killed a thing that was eating this town's fishermen, while you were sitting in the corner collecting your fees and threatening masons. And I think the room should remember that." Guard sat down. He did not do it dramatically or in anger. He sat down with the precise economic movement of a man deciding that this particular engagement was a loss and withdrawing to plan the next one. And John understood that Guard was not finished, but that tonight was over. He sat back down himself. Under the table, he felt Murbul's hand cover his, just for a moment. Her fingers were warm and dry and steady, and they pressed once firmly and then lifted. He kept his face directed toward Bren Aldwick, who was already asking to see the statements about the harbor fee, and he did not look at Murbul, and his heart was working considerably harder than the situation strictly required. The statements turned into a formal complaint to the Coastal Warden by the end of the week, and the Coastal Warden turned out to have been wanting grounds to move on Guard Dunlow for 2 years and was delighted to have them. Guard and his 2 main enforcers were removed from Crestfall by Warden's authority and told not to return, which was the kind of resolution John had not quite dared to hope for when he had begun collecting the statements, and which landed in the fishing collective like a stone into still water, sending rings of relief outward in all directions. Murbul's standing in Crestfall shifted after that. It was not a wholesale transformation. The distrust had too many years behind it to dissolve in a week, but it shifted. Bren Aldwick shook her hand in public, which counted for a great deal in a town that took its signals from Bren Aldwick. The serving boy at the Salt Anchor stopped slamming her cup down. A few of the net menders' wives, whose husbands had paid the harbor fee for years, left a bundle of fresh fish at the quarry camp path with no note, which John understood was their way of saying something they did not have the vocabulary for directly. She started coming down to the harbor wall in the afternoons, after her scouting work was finished, and sitting on a flat stone near where John worked. She did not make conversation while he was in the middle of a course. She had the instinct to not interrupt work that required attention. But when he stopped to check his measurements or rest a slab into place, she would say something, and he would answer, and gradually those exchanges grew into the kind of talking that has no practical purpose except that you want to continue hearing the other person's voice. He learned things about her. She had grown up in the Ashfield clan territories, east of the mountain passes, In the long, complicated relationship between human border settlements and orcish range land that had been 1 part trade and 2 parts tension for 100 years. She had been trained as a warrior from childhood. It was the expected path for the second daughter of a warband guard, which was what her father had been, but she had also spent 3 years as a smith's apprentice in her teens, which explained the practical, structural way she thought about materials and force. She had a sense of humor that was dry and swift and surfaced infrequently, like a fish in dark water, and every time it appeared he felt the warm surprise of it. He learned that she was 24 years old, which was young for someone who had lived as much as she had, and that she had been in Crestfall for 3 weeks before the morning she found him on the cliff top, and that she had been watching Guard Dunlow's operation for all 3 of those weeks from the quarry shelf above the village because it was a good observation post. "So you saw Guard before that morning," John said. "Yes. And you were already planning to do something about him." A pause. "I was evaluating the situation. But you stepped in that morning when he came for me specifically." She was quiet for a moment. The harbor light was long and golden across the water. "You were on his list," she said carefully. "The new mason who built the well for the collective. I had heard your name." And she looked at him with the direct, accessible look that he had learned to read as her version of consideration. "You were alone," she said, "against 3 men. And you had a wedge and you were going to use it, which was either very brave or very foolish, and I wanted to know which one." "Which was it?" "Both," she said, "which I find more interesting than either." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the harbor went gold to orange to the first gray of evening, and John Thatcher thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble." He was right, of course. He had been in a great deal of trouble for some weeks by this point, and had been managing it with the stoic patience of a man who has had a long time to get used to not having the things he wanted. He liked her. He liked her enormously, specifically, in the particular way that means you are not thinking about anyone else at all, and he was aware that she was not simply a person he liked but a person of formidable independence and clear self-sufficiency who had chosen to spend time with him for reasons he did not fully understand and was not going to press, because pressing felt like the most effective way to make her stop. He was not cowardly. He was careful. There was a difference. He had simply decided, at some point in the weeks they had worked together, that the thing between them, whatever it was too valuable to risk by treating it like something he had a right to. Then came the evening at the Salt Anchor, 2 weeks after the Thornback and 10 days after Guard Dunlow's removal, when the season turned. Bren Aldwick had organized what he called a harvest supper for the collective, which was not a harvest festival in any proper sense, but was the Crestfall version of a celebration, involving a great deal of smoked fish and dark ale, and an increasingly loud fiddle player in the corner. John went because Bren had asked him personally, and Murbul went because John asked her, and they sat together at one of the long tables among a collective of fishermen who were in the business of being pleased about things tonight and therefore managed to be, if not warm exactly, then not unfriendly, which in Crestfall was practically a welcome banner. The ale was good and the fish was excellent, and the fiddle player, whatever volume-related issues he had, was technically skilled, and at some point in the middle of the evening John became aware that Murbul was leaning against his shoulder, and that this had happened gradually and without either of them quite deciding on it, and that he was not moving, and that she was not moving, and that the warmth of her against his side was the most specific, comfortable thing he had felt in years. He turned his head slightly. She turned hers at the same moment, and they were very close, the kind of close where the decision is simply whether or not to close the remaining distance, and he could see the light from the fire in her amber eyes, and he could see that she was not backing away, and he said quietly, "Murbul." "John," she said equally quietly, "I would very much like to." He started. "Yes," she said before he finished. He kissed her. It was not a gentle or uncertain kiss. He had spent too long being careful for gentle and uncertain, and she met him with the same directness she brought to everything, her hand coming up to the side of his jaw with a deliberate, claiming warmth that was the most openly wanted he had felt in his entire life. The fiddle player played on. The fishermen talked and drank. Nobody at the long tables paid them specific attention, and if a few of them noticed and recalibrated, the recalibration was quiet and private, and this was, John thought, exactly the right way for this particular thing to happen. They walked back to the quarry camp in the dark with their hands linked, which was new and very good, and when they reached the camp and the fire had burned down to embers, he built it back up and they sat together before it, and talked for a long time, talked about things that had nothing to do with thornbacks or harbor fees or the practical business of working together. Talked about the kinds of things you talk about with someone when you are finally letting them see the inside of your life without managing what they find there. He told her about the loneliness. He did not call it that, he talked around the edges of it, the contract to contract, the moving on, the particular silence of a one-man camp, but she was precise and she followed the shape of what he was saying, and when he came to a pause she said, "I know what that is. After Draugur's band, I know exactly what that is." "It's been 2 years for you," he said. "Yes. And you've been all right." "I've been fine," she said, with a precision that he was learning to read, and it meant functional, capable, self-sufficient, all right in every practical and external sense. And also, yes, I know the shape of what you are not quite naming. He put his arm around her, and she settled into his side with the same decisive ease she brought to everything. And the fire burned and the sea made its long sound below the cliff, and John was not alone. The trouble that remained, because there was still trouble, did not announce itself but arrived sideways. It came in the form of a man named Aldrich, who was Murbul's kinsman, a second cousin from the Ashfield territories, who had tracked her here on the business of her clan, and who arrived at the quarry camp 3 days after the harvest supper, with the particular energy of someone who has been traveling hard, and is not pleased with what he expects to find at the end of the road. He was large, even for an orc, with the clan tattoos of the Doomhammer line on his throat and forearms, and he looked at John Thatcher with an expression that was clear in every important way. "You are Murbul's partner," he said to John. He said partner with a precision that meant he was being technically accurate while not extending any further. "In the Thornback contract," John said, "and in other ways, yes." Aldrich's jaw tightened. He turned to Murbul, and they spoke in Orcish for several minutes with the fluent, arguing speed of people who know each other well, and are not bothering with diplomatic pacing. John sat on his work stool and made no pretense of not listening even though he couldn't understand any of it, because pretending you don't see the thing being discussed in front of you seemed more dishonest than simply waiting. When they finished, Murbul turned to John with a face that was carefully arranged. "My clan has a problem," she said. "There is a group of raiders, human coastmen, 3 ships, working out of the Kelp Island, who have been targeting the Ashfield fishing settlements on the northern shores. They want me to come and handle it." "Are you going?" John asked. "I haven't decided," she said. Aldrich made a short, sharp sound. "I haven't decided," Murbul repeated, with a look at her cousin that carried the weight of a much longer argument. She turned back to John. "There's also the question of—" She paused, and for a moment her careful composure had a small fracture in it. "There is a clan expectation. When a warrior returns after years of solitary contract work, the clan expects her to come back into the fold, take on obligations, possibly a match arrangement with someone from the clan," John said. "Yes." He sat with this information for a moment. He was aware of Aldrich watching him with the assessing skepticism of someone who expects a particular kind of reaction. He thought about what reaction to have, and then decided that the honest one was the most useful. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said to Murbul. "It's your life and your clan, but I want you to know what I want so that it's a factor in your decision and not something you have to guess at." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay. Not in Crestfall necessarily, I'll follow whatever work I can follow, but I want you to stay with me. I think what we are is real, and I think it's worth more than walking away from." Aldrich stared at him with something between hostility and startled reassessment. Murbul was very still. Then she said to Aldrich in Orcish, something that sounded like a single sentence, measured and certain. Aldrich stared at her. He said something short. She said one word back, and whatever the word was, Aldrich closed his mouth and sat down on a boulder with the expression of a man who has not gotten what he came for and is trying to decide how to live with this. "What did you say to him?" John asked. "I told him I had already decided," Murbul said, "before he arrived." John let this land. "You were going to tell me." "I was waiting for the right moment." She looked at him with that warm, direct gaze that still hit him with the same force as the first time she had turned it on him fully. "You gave me the right moment." Aldrich stayed for 2 days. He was not friendly to John, but he was scrupulously, formally respectful in the way of someone who has accepted a situation and decided that their dignity is better preserved by acknowledging it than by fighting it. John treated him with the same courtesy, fed him from the camp pot, and did not make any effort to be anything other than what he was. On the second evening, Aldrich sat across the fire from John and said, with the air of a man measuring his words, "She is worth more than this coast." "I know she is," John said. "She chose contract work because she needed to be free of obligations after Draugr died. She has carried that loss for 2 years and she has not told anyone." He looked at John steadily. "She has told you." "Yes," John said. "Then you understand what that is." "I do," John said. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the fire and said, "If she calls on her clan, they will come. That is not nothing." "I know," John said. "I'm grateful." On the third morning, Aldrich left. He gripped Murbul by both arms in the formal Orcish way, said something quiet, and then looked at John once more with the complicated expression of a man who has not changed his mind about all of it, but has accepted the most important part. Then he went down the path toward the village and the coastal road beyond. Murbul watched him go. When he was out of sight, she turned to John, and for the first time since he had known her, there was something completely unguarded in her face, the expression of someone who has made a large and irreversible choice and is holding it in their hands and looking at it. He went to her. He did not say anything clever. He put his arms around her, and she wrapped hers around him with the full force of her considerable strength. And they stood there on the quarry shelf with the sea below them and the gray sky above, and he felt her exhale slowly against his shoulder. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Practically, I've been working contracts. I don't know how to. We'll figure it out," he said. "There's always work for a stonemason on a coast. There are walls here that need building, and the collective trusts me now. We don't need more than that to start." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I don't mean that modestly. I mean I get up before dawn and I carry my blades everywhere and I don't ask for help and I'm not good at it." "I get up before dawn," he said. "I carry my tools everywhere. I'm not good at asking for help either." He pulled back to look at her. "I think we'll be fine." She looked at him, and then she did something she had only done once or twice before. She let herself smile fully without closing it off, the tusks and the warmth of her all at once. It was one of the most beautiful things John had ever seen. "Fine," she said. "Yes, I think we will." The weeks that followed were the best of John Thatcher's life up to that point, and he had a faint, pleased awareness of this fact as he was living them, which was unusual for him. He was the kind of man who recognized good things most clearly in retrospect, but this was too present and too specific to defer. He woke in the mornings with something forward-looking in his chest. He worked with a satisfaction that was not new. He had always loved the work, but was richer now, fuller, because there was someone to come back to in the evenings, and someone to tell about the interesting seam in the northwest cliff face, and someone who would listen with real attention, and occasionally say something precise and useful that changed how he was thinking about the problem. She took on work of her own, escort contracts for the fishing boats during the seasonal runs, when coastmen raiders were a real risk, and 2 short contracts from villages up the coast that had heard about the thornback and wanted a professional assessment of their own cliff caves. She was good at her work in the way that people are good at things they have done for a long time with genuine commitment, and John watched her come back from these contracts with the particular satisfaction of work well done, and thought that this was also, in its way, something he had not had before, someone to be proud of. But the real centerpiece of this season, the moment that would define it afterward when they told the story, came not in the quarry camp or on the harbor wall, but in the Salt Anchor, on a wet autumn evening when the rain was coming off the water sideways and every fisherman in Crestfall was inside. It was crowded, which was relevant. John was there at Bren Aldwick's request, because Bren was finalizing the new collective contract for the winter wall repairs and wanted John to walk through the scope before it was signed. Murbul had come with him, and they sat at the end of one of the long tables while Bren laid out his charts, and John went through the scope of work with the patient attention to detail that made him good at his job. There was a man at the bar named Oswin, who was a net merchant out of Kelport and who had been drinking since afternoon and who had opinions. He had opinions about orcs specifically, and about the arrangement in Crestfall specifically, and about whatever contract or standing the orc woman at the end of the table had apparently been given, and he had been sharing these opinions in the way of someone who is gauging the room's receptiveness to escalation. John had been aware of Oswin from the corner of his eye for 20 minutes. He had also been aware that Murbul was aware of Oswin, in the same way she was aware of everything, that flat, patient peripheral attention, and was choosing to not respond, which was the correct choice and cost her something he understood it cost her. Then Oswin ran out of gauge the room patience and committed. He got up from the bar with his cup and walked toward their table with the elaborate casualness of a drunk man attempting to look deliberate, and he stopped behind Murbul and he said, loud enough for the room, "I heard they gave you the Thornback bounty. Funny thing that. A creature like that, all armor and no sense, getting paid to do the dirty work. Kind of familiar, wouldn't you say?" The room went quiet. John was already moving when Oswin's hand went to his belt knife. He had not thought it would escalate to a knife. He had thought Oswin was the kind of drunk who makes ugly speeches and goes home feeling victorious, which was unpleasant but manageable. He had not read the specific depth of the man's dislike or the particular recklessness that came with it, and he was revising this assessment rapidly as the knife came out. But here is what happened. Oswin did not pull the knife on Murbul. He pulled it on John. Because John was on his feet and between Oswin and Murbul in the first second, and the knife was meant for whoever was closest, and that was John. Murbul moved faster. She came up from her seat with a single fluid motion that covered the distance between her and Oswin in no time at all, and she grabbed John's wrist, his right wrist, raised to block with one hand, a grip like a rope anchor, and she put herself between John and the knife with her body, her left arm sweeping Oswin's blade hand outward and down, and she had one of her own blades at his throat before the room had finished going silent. She did not say anything for a moment. The room held its breath. Then she said very quietly with her eyes on Oswin and her body between him and John, "Put it down, or I will put you down." Oswin put it down. What happened in the room after that, the rapid collective reassessment, the two fishermen who grabbed Oswin by the arms, the voices, Bren Aldwick standing up at the table. John was aware of only at a remove because he was looking at the back of Murbul's shoulders, the rigid line of them, the controlled force in the set of her body, the hand that was still wrapped around his wrist, grounding him. She turned when Oswin was being removed from the building, and she looked at John. His wrist was still in her hand. She looked down at her own grip and then back at him, and he could see that she was working to steady something, not shaking, not visibly, but there was a rawness in her face that she had not closed off yet. "You were in front of me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was something between a statement and a question. "You were the target," he said. "I wasn't going to let John," she said, and the way she said his name had that same quality as the first time, that precision of someone dropping a formality they had maintained for specific reasons. "You have to let me protect you sometimes." He looked at her, at the grip on his wrist, at the rawness in her face that was, he understood, not just the aftermath of the physical response but something deeper, the specific alarm of someone realizing, in a very concrete and immediate way, that they care more than they had fully accounted for. "You did protect me," he said. "You grabbed my wrist. You put yourself between me and the blade." He held her gaze. "That's not something you do for someone you don't." "I know what it is," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "I know exactly what it is." She did not let go of his wrist. Bren Aldwick, who was a man of considerable practical wisdom, chose this moment to say that the contract could wait until tomorrow, and to recommend that everyone go home and get dry. The room accepted this wisdom. People filtered out. John and Murbul stood in the half-emptied salt anchor with the fire going and the rain on the shutters and her hand still around his wrist, and the moment stretched between them like a stone resting perfectly in its course. "I'm not going to pretend," she said, "that this is uncomplicated, that I am uncomplicated. I am a warrior who works alone and has spent 2 years deciding that closeness costs too much to risk. I am not," she paused, "I am not easy." "Murbul," he said patiently, "you've already told me this." "I know. I'm saying it again because you're afraid," he said with no particular emphasis, just the plain fact of it. She looked at him and then slowly she said, "Yes." "So am I," he said. "I've been alone for a long time and I am not used to being the kind of person that someone stays for. It terrifies me. I'm telling you anyway because not telling you feels worse." He turned his hand over so that his wrist was no longer a wrist being held but a hand holding hers back. "I want this. I want you. I'm not asking you to be easy. I'm asking you to stay." The fire popped. The rain came down. "I grabbed your wrist because I couldn't think of anything else," she said, in a tone that was as stripped down and honest as anything he had ever heard from her. "Because you were going to take that blade, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." She swallowed. "That was the moment I knew I had already decided. Everything else has been me acknowledging the decision that was already made." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of her knuckles, not a dramatic gesture, just a very certain one. She watched him do it. She breathed. "Then we've both already decided," he said. "Yes," she said, "we have." They walked back to the quarry camp through the rain, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the rain made halos in the lamplight and the harbor was invisible in the dark below them. And John Thatcher felt the absence shape in his life fit itself around the specific, real, irreplaceable presence of this person beside him, and it was not a dream or a wish or a careful, hopeful fantasy. It was real. It was here. She was here. That night at the quarry camp, with the rain on the canvas and the fire rebuilt inside the stone ring and the two of them finally, privately, alone in the way they had not quite been before, all the careful management of distance and proximity and what it was, and what it wasn't set aside at last. Murbul turned to him with no ambiguity and no retreat and the full, open warmth of a woman who has decided and is not going to pretend otherwise. She kissed him, not gently, in the way of someone who has been patient about a thing long enough. He answered her without hesitation, with everything that had been building for months, and what followed was the warmth and weight and extraordinary specific happiness of two people who have been alone for too long finally being exactly where they are supposed to be, which is next to each other, with no space left between them. He fell asleep with her arm across his chest and her steady breathing in his ear, and the sound of the rain going slowly gentler against the canvas, and he slept better than he had in years. Autumn came fully to Crestfall then, with the particular quality of an autumn on a working coast, cold and salt-edged and full of the serious business of preparation. The collective contracted John for the winter wall work and the repair of the harbor's eastern breakwater, which had taken damage in the previous winter storms and needed proper reconstruction before the season's worst weather arrived. It was good work, substantial and technically satisfying, and he spent his days at the harbor with a small crew of the collective's men who had graduated from tolerating his presence to genuinely trusting his judgment, which was all he had ever wanted from a work arrangement. Murbul took a winter escort contract with one of the fishing captains, guarding a cargo run south to the market ports, and was gone for 3 weeks, which were the longest 3 weeks of John's recent experience. She sent a letter by the coastal post, a single half-page of her precise, slightly angular handwriting, detailing the practical facts of the contract, and then at the bottom, a single sentence in Orcish that he could not read and had to ask a half-Orcish dock worker to translate, who looked at him with a specific kind of knowing expression and said it meant approximately, "I think about the fire. I'll be back soon." He kept the letter in his coat. When she came back by the harbor road in the late afternoon, and he saw her from the breakwater, the distinctive silhouette, the braid, the pauldron catching the low light, and he put his tools down on the stone and walked to meet her, and she saw him coming and walked faster, and they met in the harbor lane with people all around, and she put her arms around him with the same certain force as always and held him for a long moment. "You got the letter," she said. "I had it translated," he said. She pulled back and looked at him with the small smile. "All of it? Just the Orcish part, the practical report I could handle myself." "Good," she said. "I wasn't ready to just write it in common. Some things need the right language." He understood this perfectly. The coastal warden's office in Kelport sent a formal commendation to Crestfall for the resolution of the Thornback problem and the Dunlow extortion case, which arrived addressed jointly to the fishing collective and to Murbul Doomhammer. Bren Aldwick read it at a collective meeting, and then, in the particular Crestfall way of not making a large event out of something but making sure the record was noted, he folded it and put it in the collective's formal ledger, which was where things of permanent standing were kept. Murbul read the copy Bren gave her with the careful attention of someone who has not had many official documents directed to her by name, and John, watching her read it, saw something move in her face, a quiet satisfaction layered not just for the recognition but for what the recognition meant. Standing, a name in a ledger, a coastal town that knew her. "How does it feel?" John asked. "Specific," she said. "Not what I expected. Better." Dorrell, the last of Gart's men who had stayed in Crestfall after the others were removed, tried one more time. He waited outside the Salt Anchor on an evening in late autumn with 2 men John had not seen before, hired help, clearly, and not particularly distinguished, and he blocked the lane with the intention of making some final statement about the situation. He looked at Murbul and he looked at John, and then he looked at Murbul again, and Murbul looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has already solved this problem in her head and is simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. And after approximately 10 seconds, Dorrell stepped out of the lane and took his hired help with him and walked away toward the docks. And that was, definitively, the end of Guard Dunlow's operation in Crestfall. John put his arm around Murbul's shoulders and they walked on toward the Salt Anchor, and she said, "That was anticlimactic." "The best resolutions usually are," John said. She made that quick, involuntary laugh again, and he felt it in his whole chest. Winter came hard to the coast, as it always did, with the north wind off the open sea and the harbor turning the gray-green of deep cold. John's breakwater work, continued stonework, is not stopped by cold, only made more demanding, and the quarry camp was upgraded with a proper stone wind wall on the north side, which John built in 3 days in the first real cold snap, and which was, if he was being honest, primarily motivated by the fact that Murbul said she liked watching him work quickly. She sparred in the mornings on the flat cliff shelf above the camp, working through her forms with the disciplined focus of a professional who knew that capability is maintenance work, and John sometimes stopped whatever he was doing to watch, which he was not particularly subtle about, and she knew he was watching and did not discourage it. On a winter morning when the harbor was frosted and the world had the specific clean, cold beauty of a coast after a hard night, She sat across the campfire from him and said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "When Aldrich came and told me there was an expectation, a match arrangement, I had already decided, before he finished speaking. I want you to know that was not a difficult decision. It was the clearest decision I've made in years." She held his gaze with the full, direct amber warmth of her eyes. "I want to say it plainly because I should have said it more plainly before. I chose you. I'm not here because the contracts ran out or because it was convenient or because I needed somewhere to be. I'm here because you are who you are, and that is what I want." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. A gull called somewhere above the cliff. "I've been overlooked my whole life," he said, not with bitterness, just with the plain honesty he used for large, true things. Not badly, not cruelly. "I've just been the background of other people's rooms for a long time. Quiet, useful, present. I know what it is to not be seen." He looked at her. "You see me. I don't mean you tolerate me or you've gotten used to me. I mean you see me, what I am, what I think, what I'm trying to be. That's not—" He paused. "I don't know what to do with it except be grateful and be here." She stood up and came around the fire and sat beside him, close against his side, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head briefly, with the contained affection of someone for whom this gesture was still new enough to be deliberate, against his shoulder. "You don't need to be grateful," she said. "You just need to stay." "I'm staying," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat by the fire while the frost melted off the cliff grass and the sun came up over the sea, and the harbor below them caught the light. The rite happened on the last day of autumn by the old calendar, a date Aldrich had apparently communicated to Murbul as significant in the Doomhammer clan's reckoning, when the claiming rites could formally be witnessed. John had known it was coming. Murbul had explained it to him 2 weeks before, in the careful, slightly circling way she had of discussing things that mattered deeply to her. "In my clan," she had said, "when a warrior decides to claim someone permanently, publicly, she kneels before witnesses. It's the oldest rite. It means I put myself at your level. I'm not claiming ownership, I am claiming kinship, partnership, the irreversible kind." "Who witnesses?" he had asked. "Whoever matters," she said. "There's no minimum. In a formal warband ceremony, it would be 50 people." Out here, she had looked at the harbor, and he had understood that she was asking whether Crestfall, this specific complicated town that was slowly becoming theirs, was adequate witness for the rite. He had gone to Bren Aldwick the next morning and explained the situation simply and directly, and Bren had listened with his characteristic no-time-for-nonsense patience, and at the end he had said, "How many witnesses does she need?" "Whoever wants to come," John said. Bren had nodded once. "I'll see to it." So on the last day of autumn, with a clear cold sky over the harbor and the sea running dark blue and the whole Crestfall fishing collective, plus a number of other people, John hadn't specifically planned for spread out on the cliff shelf above the harbor, Murbul Doomhammer stood before John Thatcher, and without preamble or oratory, went down on one knee. She looked up at him from that position with the full, open gaze she had been allowing him for months, no armor, no arrangement, just her, and she said in her even, carrying voice, "John Thatcher, I claim you as mine and I give myself to be claimed in return. You will not be alone again. I will be at your left side and your right side and between you and whatever comes for you, and I will not leave. This is permanent. You are wanted. You are mine if you will be." The harbor behind her was dazzling in the cold light. The crowd on the cliff shelf was absolutely still. John looked down at her, at this extraordinary woman, this force of nature in leather and iron who had walked out of a cliff road morning and upended the whole quiet, functional, slightly lonesome shape of his life, and he said, "I will be, and you are mine if you will be." "I already am," she said. She rose, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her with the entire crowd watching. And the entire crowd, Bren Aldwick, the net menders, the dock workers, the fishermen, Boren Haslek's wife who had brought the fish without a note, and all the others who had watched the whole improbable season unfold, made the collective sound of people who have been holding their breath and are now releasing it. Aldrich was there, standing at the back of the crowd. John had not known he was coming. He caught Aldrich's eye across the crowd, and Aldrich looked at him with the complicated expression of a man who has not given easy approval of this, but has given the only kind that matters, honest acceptance. He nodded once. John nodded back. The celebration afterward was held at the Salt Anchor, which was not large enough for all the people who tried to get into it, and several people ended up on the outer benches in the cold with cups of hot cider from the kitchen window, and the fiddle player played for 4 hours straight, and it was, by every measure that John had ever used to evaluate a good evening, the best of his life. They walked home in the dark, the two of them, up the harbor lane and along the cliff path to the quarry camp. The stars were out over the water, which was rare in autumn on this coast, and the cold air was still, and Murbul walked at his side with her hand in his and her shoulder against his shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "Like I've set down something very heavy," she said, "not because it was a burden, but because carrying it required constant attention, and now it's set down in the right place and I can simply be." She looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Like the room finally has a person in it," he said. She made a small sound of understanding. Then, "Good." "Yes," he said. "Very good." The quarry campfire was banked when they arrived, and John rebuilt it, his hands knowing the motions as well as breathing now, and Murbul sat on the stone beside the fire ring and pulled off her boots with the comfortable domesticity of someone who has been coming home to a place long enough to be fully at ease in it. And the flames built, and the harbor was invisible below in the dark, and the night was quiet and theirs. He sat beside her and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the full certain warmth of it, the specific, unfakeable weight of her, the copper ring in her braid cool against his jaw, her hand flat on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, was more real and more complete than anything he had built out of stone. "Murbul," he said. "John," she said. No qualifiers, no conditions. Just their names in the dark, which were now, in the most permanent and practical and beautiful sense, two halves of the same sentence. The fire burned. The sea breathed below the cliff. The stars held their positions over Crestfall, over the harbor and the breakwater and the wells John had built, and the cliff face where the sea cave was sealed, and the salt anchor where a ledger held a name, and above the quarry shelf, where the stonemason and the warrior sat together in the light of a fire that neither of them would let go out. He had built walls his whole life. Walls to hold things up, to keep the sea back, to mark the place where what was his ended and what was not began. He understood walls. He understood what they were for and when they served and when they didn't. He understood, sitting in the firelight with Murbul's steady warmth against his side, that the specific wall he had built around the absent center of himself, the patient, functional, unsentimental wall of a man who has learned not to need what he does not have, had been laid to rest tonight. Not knocked down. That was too dramatic, and he was not a dramatic man. Simply laid to rest. Set down, like she said, in the right place. He was wanted. He was chosen. He was claimed by the kind of person who does not claim carelessly, who had gone down on her knee before all of Crestfall and said so in the oldest words available to her. He was not alone. He would not be again. The fire burned. The harbor dreamed below the cliff. Murbul Doomhammer slept against his shoulder, and John Thatcher stayed awake a little longer just to keep the fire going and to be present in this specific good thing, this exact night. This particular and irreplaceable life that had found its other half on a cliff road in the morning mist, which was not where he would have looked for it, but was, as it turned out, precisely where it had always been going to be. He let the fire burn down when she was fully asleep, and then he lay down beside her, and the stars made their slow turn above the coast, and the sea kept its rhythm, and morning would come the same as always, cold and salt-edged and full of work to do, and he would do it and she would be there, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.